The one and only international affairs analyst Dan Perry, and here in our Tel Aviv studios, the one and only Dan Perry, international affairs analyst.
Trump will portray almost anything as a witch hunt. I agree that the cartoonish aspect of this particular case may mean that it ultimately doesn't move the needle. But the cases coming down the pike, as we say, especially involving January 6th, very well might, not necessarily with the Republican base, but with voters in the center whom Trump needs in order to stand any chance in November 24.
The lack of trust that we, the right in Israel and the ultra-Orthodox, we have a policy, and we believe in it, and we're trying to promote it, and that is why we went through elections. And we know what we're doing. We know what we're doing. It's not a tactic.
What you are trying to do here is to reduce democracy to its most vulgar baseline of majority rule. And I have to say, that is not so popular, including among Likud voters. The idea that 51% can decide to do anything is infantile. I think if you ask the people, should 51% be able to kill 49%? Most would agree that's not a democratic outcome.
How should the Israeli government react to the Eritrean clashes? We cannot start a conversation without the opening remarks of Dan Perry.
Cracking down on the rioters, who showed quite a bit of chutzpah, is not unwarranted. But I would hope the government experiences a learning moment that spurs understanding that their transparent policy of trying to compel the Eritreans and others to leave by means of petty abuses like denying them work permits and basic social protections may not be the way to go. What's needed is a bit of sagacity and a bit of generosity, qualities that are perhaps in short supply in government circles at present.
Just looking at it as a broader picture rather than just solely focusing on gun control. Why are we completely avoiding everything else?
I think I can answer the question. I have had to do with the coverage of about 100 countries. None have had the degree of gun ownership that you have in the U.S. Your statement is essentially false. The correlation between gun ownership and the incidence of firearm deaths is spectacularly high. Americans are actually asked to accept something preposterous, which is that there's no connection between how many people have guns and how many people die when you see that there is a correlation. America has about 10 gun deaths per 100,000. That is 40 times more than the rate in Britain, which banned guns. You really think the two aren't connected? There is no country in the world that has more guns than people. That's the case in America. And that's probably why America, with 5% of the world's population, has about a third of the massacres. The connection is obvious. And the NRA's claim that guns don't kill people, people kill people, is preposterous when it's very clear that people with guns kill people. There is a tremendous interest on the part of the West in making clear that authoritarian regimes that are aggressive towards their neighbors cannot and should not prosper. That's obvious. But there's another interest, which is avoiding World War III. And the fact is that Putin's regime is somewhat inscrutable. We don't know what they might do. And there's a delicate balance at play here. That is why the West has been put in a somewhat undignified position of appearing to hedge. And I have a lot of sympathy for people like Biden because I'm not sure what I would do. It's easy to sit here in the studio and say that Russia must be defeated. But if the consequence of that is nuclear war in Western Europe, then maybe that's not the best idea. It is still conceivable, not likely, I'm not predicting this, but it is conceivable that other things might happen that do not appear to be probable right now. Maybe regime change in Russia. That probably is the best thing. Maybe some kind of compromise involving a slight come down by Ukraine under certain circumstances. Maybe where Ukraine becomes a member of the European Union on a fast track. One can conceive of more creative options than merely going for total victory against a potentially maniacal dictator who could be out of control. I'm saying we have to be wise and not just right.
What is China's game plan?
It's fair to say that China's goal is to achieve global primacy, displacing the U.S. and the West, maybe by the middle of the century. And, by size of economy, it's not inconceivable. They might achieve something close to that. Also, not necessarily true that they will, but more interesting, I think, more of a challenge where we can be more skeptical is whether they can ever really project innovation as opposed to just industry replication and theft, or whether they can project soft power, the soft power of a true superpower, which requires cultural affinity of the sort that is not their forte, nor something they have necessarily desired. I see no reason why the West should reevaluate its attitude towards Putin. At this point, there's not that much to be done, and the past war, other than a terrible cost wrought upon Ukraine, obviously, has not been unsuccessful from the point of view of the West. Consider how badly Russia has been hobbled. It is no longer able to wield energy blackmail upon the West. It is no longer considered a good faith player in the world economy and in diplomacy. Its military has lost any semblance of deterrence and even of a sense of competence. Russia is going to be impoverished and isolated, as I say, for a long, long time because of Putin. Dictators seem invulnerable and omnipotent until suddenly they're not. Like bankruptcies, collapse of dictatorial regimes happens slowly and then quickly.
This whole incident or moment sort of highlight, the limits of the UN, the Security Council, in terms of its ability to have anything to do with containing Russia at this point.
Oh, the UN Security Council can't do anything to contain Russia because Russia itself can veto any such action. And certainly anyone interested in portraying the UN as somehow absurd will need look no further than the fact that the president, country that holds the presidency of the Security Council, is one whose leader has just been indicted for war crimes. The Security Council clearly is a bit of an anachronism. I mean, it reflects the power structure after World War II. And as a consequence of that, there's a punitive aspect in that Germany and Japan, two of the world's biggest economies who lost that war, are not represented, whereas the UK and France are. A far more logical Security Council would kick out the UK and France, replace them with the EU, and in a way punish the UK as such for Brexit, and bring in Brazil and India. There's other issues around this. What to do when a Security Council member is not even the president, just a rogue player on the world stage. But I would remind everyone that the Soviet Union was a founding member of the UN Security Council itself, was a member the day it was founded in 1945, and they soon went on to take over Eastern Europe effectively through various machinations. They were a rogue player long before Putin entered the scene.
There are rich black people in this country. There are poor black people. There are rich
Joe
Asians.
Bob,
there are poor Asians. There are rich white people. There are poor white people. So to say that the color of your skin is solely determinative of how you can achieve in this culture is not accurate.
Look, I can help you out here because there's a reason why people think that. There is an enormous income gap in the U.S. and an even greater and completely inadmissible wealth gap. And it's understandable if you're talking about immigrants who came from poor and underdeveloped countries. But 10 generations down the road, if this is persistently the case, and if it diminishes not with great speed, then clearly there has been a failure. Ellie, it's not affirmative action that's failed. It's American society that has failed. And clearly there is an education failure. Clearly there is not enough being done in terms of frameworks and incentives. And therefore, a corrective action is needed. This is a matter of semantics,
but can you fix an injustice with an injustice? That's the basic question.
Well, the idea is that it isn't necessarily an injustice, because if you are making a special effort to identify the future potential of people who have not had the chance to show past achievement because they come from inner city schools which do not provide the same education as fine private schools, then obviously you're just attempting in some way to level the playing field. I do admit that it can feel terrible to people who were once dominant and now are the beheaded aristocrat. But there is an argument that the societal good is to increase the amount of happiness for the greatest number of people, and that's John Stuart Mill. It's not me speaking. People's lives are in danger. You simply cannot just turn them away. I mean, there are humanitarian obligations, and there's also just the question of humanity. However, there's a big difference between that and any notion that countries don't have the right to police their borders or to restrict immigration, and that issue becomes ever more acute when there are perceived cultural differences. And I think that is what we're really talking about at the end of the day.
Are the U.S. and Israel getting a divorce?
I don't know about a divorce, but I think infidelity is certainly possible. I mean, Israel needs the
Sometimes it's a better
US.
solution, right?
And Israel has wanted more than a marriage. Israel wants a special relationship, and it has had one. And that relationship is based on more than just interests. The idea of shared values. Now, the current government of Israel does not share values with the Biden administration, Democratic Party, most Americans, and I think most American Jews.
Should French schools ban abiyas?
Dan Perry, your take?
My take is that a wise man would avoid this debate at all costs.
And yet,
as a liberal, I cannot possibly wholeheartedly embrace bans on clothing or limits of expression. On the other hand, I do respect the right of the French secular state to promote secularism in its state schools if it's egalitarian vis-a-vis all religions and if it has broad public support.
does French domestic policy inadvertently fuel extremism?
Banning cultural manifestations of certain minorities obviously is going to alienate those communities. It's going to deepen the sense of discrimination, and it could very well provide a tool for the recruitment by extremists of new extremists. I think the French know this, though. I doubt it's inadvertent. I think they view this as a fight they must engage in.
You have now many territories. When you go inside, you are not in France. You believe you are in an Arabic country where applies the Sharia, where applies the dress code of Saudi Arabia. This is not France.
It's been 22 years, wow, since the terror attack that changed the world as we know it. Is it a safer or a more dangerous one now? What is the long-enduring legacy of 9/11?
And the legacy is widespread distrust of Islam and even of Muslims, obsession, understandable obsession about security and terrorism, devastating wars that left the Middle East in ashes and weren't that successful. And of course, it took the joy out of flying entirely.
Yeah, you can no longer just hop on a plane with a plastic bag, can you?
If we'll have a deal on the table, a normalization deal, a peace treaty, whatever, I think that Netanyahu will be able to have a majority. The question is, what will happen to his coalition? I have no idea about that. As my colleague said, it will be very, very interesting these coming months.
Yes. Well,
I have to say, Ellie, this is a truly historic day because I find myself in agreement with Mr. Katz. There is no doubt that if Netanyahu succeeds in bringing about this deal, he will have his majority in parliament because whatever the right-wing nuts are going to do, Benny Gantz and Yair Lapid's party will certainly support. Hamas is understood to be part of an Islamist vanguard under the control of Iran to various degrees. That is itself at war with moderate Sunni countries that surround Israel. So yeah, I think Israel has some latitude to respond here, but the line of credit is not without limits. The job in the previous rounds was to get Hamas to stop the rocket fire. More or less, that was it. And in each case, that was achieved. Now the trouble is the degree of savagery that we saw on October 7th. The political earthquake that created in Israel, the strategic disaster that entailed, makes everyone believe that we can no longer go back to the status quo ante and something must be done. But Israel risks blundering into a classic logical fallacy, which is something must be done. A ground invasion is a thing, therefore a ground invasion must be done. And I haven't yet heard anyone articulate how a ground invasion would remove Hamas from power without embroiling everyone in not only an almost certain greater loss of life on the ground that would happen October 7th, but risk a massive conflagration in the region, which also, by the way, would be a spectacular gift handed on a platter to Iran. So assuming they're not all idiots, there's savages there, but I'm not sure they're idiots. They must have known something big was coming. And so presumably there are people who foresaw that Israel would go in there, and they're not only just booby-trapping the buildings, but they booby-trapped the entire strategy.
Qatar finances Hamas. Qatar hosts Hamas. And yet, potentially, these are the brokers that may make a difference. Your take?
It's absurd. I watch the world sometimes in utter stupefaction, honestly. When abnormal things become normal, when unacceptable becomes acceptable, the world has some leverage over Qatar. Qatar wants to be accepted as a member in good standing of the community of civilized nations. They host the World Cup. They pretend to be a normative country. I would hope that if the world wanted to do something useful, the West, they would apply maximal pressure on Qatar with a carrot as well as a stick, that they can do that. They can maybe get the Sunni world to stop being a little bit nasty towards Qatar. For a while there, they were totally ostracized by Saudi Arabia and other countries in exchange for understanding that it is no longer acceptable in any way, shape, or form to support Hamas. If the Hamas numbers are wrong and inflated, then they should make that case. If they are truly, as I believe they are, making every effort to avoid civilian casualties, make the case daily and profoundly. And look, Netanyahu can convince anyone of anything sometimes, it seems. He has deployed his rhetorical powers for weaker cases than this one and for less important outcomes. If Israel wants to be given, by the Americans even, despite their sympathy, enough time to achieve the goals that I think most Israelis and most people in the world who really are knowledgeable know is necessary, the eradication of Hamas, they have to keep that window of opportunity open. And to think closing it is the civilian casualties narrative. It is an emergency.
We continue to see just this increased activity on the northern front. Israel continuing to threaten Hezbollah and Lebanon, therefore saying don't get more involved, saying that we will, in their words, even turn Beirut into Gaza if they need to with their military activity. But all of this as the United States is also pressuring Israel not to do that.
The United States is also threatening implicitly on its own by having two carrier groups just off the coast of Lebanon, more or less. It is really unbelievable. Hezbollah evidently wants to get credit for helping Hamas a little bit without paying the price, I suppose. It doesn't seem they're eager for a full-blown war, else they would have instigated it. I am amazed, frankly, that Israel tolerates this. And as some viewers will know who've seen me before, I'm very far from a warmonger. I'm a person of moderation. I prefer partition of the Holy Land and a peace process and compromise. But realistically, Hezbollah firing rockets at Israel on a day like today when there's this whole other front in the south and Israel is supposed to accept this somehow. There is a sense in Israel that everything changed on October 7th and what was before cannot again be. But one thing that will be is that the Holy Land, Israel, Palestine, has 15 million people, roughly equally divided between Jews and Arabs. And the idea of an ultimate partition remains the only solution I can see to avoid a binational, non-Jewish state. And that will remain. And that will remain a discourse in the world after this war is over. And currently, it's not friendly to Israel.
It's the day after the war is certainly a question that is on everyone's mind. But for now, we're focusing on exactly the war at hand and the latest updates. International affairs analyst Dan Perry, thank you for providing your insight into exactly what's happening here on the ground. Day 42 of the war here in Israel. Thank you.
My pleasure.